Welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today is just Phil here, and having recently played my first games of the season after Operation Last Refuge 2 a few weeks ago, I was really excited to talk about some of my observations, realizations, key moments, etc. It's super fun to get back to Airsoft, but Pat is super busy right now marking for school, so I figured I'd just jump right in and do this episode by myself, and Pat will be able to join us later. Before I go any further, I do want to remind you we still have many of the, or not many, but several of the Storm Riders Discord community patches available. These patches are available on our Discord. You can see the link there. They are like $15 Canadian, shipped anywhere around the world, flat rate, so you can certainly get you some. We have a few left. And then we will eventually be discontinuing them. Once these are gone, we won't be ordering them anymore. We won't be making any more. We might do a new logo, who knows? But for right now, these are going to be available at least until August, at which point we will be closing down the online shop for those. So if you haven't picked yours up, they are still available, so get you one. So today I really wanted to start by talking about my experiences at the first couple of games that I've played. I played an evening game and then a weekend game. I haven't played an evening game in a long time. We'll talk about that and how that was in a little bit. But in particular, I mean, if you've been following along with the podcast for the last several months, you will know that I switched my AEG, my replica, over from an AEG to an HPA over the winter. This was a huge switch for me, and so I want to talk about some of those changes, and that have been pretty significant. I mean, I have been doing a lot of ready ups at home, but nothing really is a substitute for actually getting out there and playing. And I learned a lot of lessons in the first few games. So hopefully some of these lessons will resonate with some of you, or at least encourage you to trial some things and not be worried about, looking foolish or whatever. So let's just jump right in and we can start talking about it. So as I mentioned, I switched from AEG to HPA for replica. Pat was nice enough to give me a tank line and reg for my birthday and Christmas. And then I went up and I was able to get a Kythera engine. And really, this was a bit of a switch for me, both in obviously in my gear, but also in my mindset. I did not think that I would want to switch to go back to a remote line in a tank, which is something I had done in paintball for, many, many years ago. And I thought, well, that's one of the things I wanted to get away from. But really, having had the opportunity to use Pat's HPA and use Steph's HPA, the Kythera in particular, it really wasn't that bad. And on the AEG side of things, my primary motivator was I was really getting at my wit's end with my AEG. My motor kept running hot. I couldn't get the performance I was looking for. And I really didn't feel like I had the skills or the time really to invest in getting it where I wanted. I was being more frustrated than anything else. And HPA seemed a pretty good way to sort of bypass a lot of that, in addition to the fact that just from a content creation point of view, HPA is much less noisy than an AEG, which would make for more enjoyable footage. So all those things aside, I think HPA was the easiest way for me to resolve my electrical motor issues, etc., by replacing it with a system that's purely mechanical. Like I mentioned, I'm using a Kythera, which means that there is no battery, there is no electronic fire control. It's literally just a mechanical system. I had used Steph's a few times. I used Pat's as well, I think, once. And I have to say, one of the things I liked the most about it was the feel of the trigger. Like, I really enjoyed that the way that the trigger feels in terms of like the positive feedback that you get from that trigger. Whereas previously, I would pull the trigger and it's just, a switch inside the MOSFET, which is not a bad thing. It's just the feel of that mechanical trigger was super nice. And that made it a bit of an easy sell. But it's also been an interesting challenge. I think I conceptually knew a lot about how AEG replicas worked. And so when I had issues, I could very easily go, oh, it's probably this, it's probably that, and so on. And I could troubleshoot with Pat. But with HPA, I didn't have any of that knowledge. So even, last week I took to the Discord, which is full of people who are very familiar with HPA setups in particular. And I asked the question, hey, HPA users, this is the problem that I'm having. What does this sound like to you? Is it a generic problem? Like if you have used mid caps and AEGs before, I'm sure you've heard the term mid cap syndrome. Like, is that what I'm experiencing, or is there something else? And as it turns out, absolutely there is. With my Kythera in particular, I need a different metering screw, a little bit lower than what it ships with. And I'm actually not bummed about that at all. Like, yeah, it's a pain. I have to order one, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But with my AEG, anytime I'd have an issue, I'd be very frustrated with it. I'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe this. This is so frustrating. I tried everything. Whereas there, I was like, actually, okay, well, no, there's a solution to metering screw. We'll put it in. Now, ask if that doesn't fix the problem, you will have another conversation about it. But I really felt that it's like it's a known issue, like it's a known factor, and so I just need to do that. And in point of fact, after posting my question, I had two or three people message me directly, being like, "Hey, it's the metering screw. Don't do anything else. Get a lower metering screw first, and then try again." And so that's what I've done, and I feel pretty confident about that. Because aside from that, I think when I looked at the consistency aspect that I was trying to fix with the max hop up, and then switching to a 6.01 millimeter barrel, and then doing my own inner barrel polishing using polishing compound and the drill and all this kind of stuff, it's been very consistent. Like when it was shooting, because the main issue that I was having was feeding with the mags. As the mags would get lower and lower, they wouldn't feed consistently. But when it was feeding, it was shooting very accurately. Still needs a little bit of tweaking in terms of the hop up to get it exactly where I need to, and of course, still some alignment with the nozzle that it's going to have to be redone once I take it apart and put it back together. But other than that, I've been really, really satisfied, and that's good because I'm hitting the field with all kinds of changes to my kit. I'm, not only carrying an HPA instead of an AEG, but that means I have a tank and a line, which I haven't done before, and I have a new optic on my replica as well, which changes things a little bit. So there's a lot of different things that were changing that I had to get accustomed to, and it wasn't that bad. Like, yes, it felt a little strange, but my personal skills were fine. Like I've been, like we've always talked about, I'm doing my ready ups and I'm very familiar with the mechanics. I don't have any trouble offside shooting, and I'm not tangling myself in the remote line and all this kind of stuff. So that was fine. But it's feeling very different. It's feeling like a bit of a learning curve again, and I'm super comfortable with that. Now, I did mention I do have a different barrel. That the barrel is the same length as before, so ergonomically it doesn't change anything about the rifle. Using the sight is different, so I'm using a Holosun, like a very basic Holosun model. It's a real steel sight as opposed to a replica, which I've always used. Honestly, like I like it. It's fine. I don't necessarily think it's any meaningfully better than the SRS that I was using before. But we'll have to see. Like I haven't taken the time to zero it. The zero outside out of the box was actually pretty okay. I really only just set the hop up and then I just did some holes and stuff just to play around with it. But once my replica gets completely dialed in, then I'll be dialing in the scope as well, or the sight, I should say. And it was fine. I have a Lexine protector on there that I've taped down. Chris cut it to size for me, and it fits perfectly. So that's been a bit of an adaptation. But honestly, I mean, a dot is a dot. The rifle comes up, acquire sight picture, pull the trigger, and that hasn't changed. So mechanically, no big deal there. One of the things that I have found really different, and for those of you who may be switching from AEG to HPA, this might have been something that you experienced. And for me, I really, really experienced this on Thursday night when I played the evening game at the outdoor field, because I've been using an AEG for the last 15 years essentially, and I'm very, very, very familiar with what my AEG sounds like when it's shooting, and also what it sounds like when it's dry firing, right? When it's empty. I don't know what that sounds like with an HPA. I haven't fired enough rounds to know for sure. And so one of the problems that I was encountering was that I was having this issue where my mags, as they got lower, wouldn't necessarily feed the next BB, and I would be dry firing, but I couldn't hear the difference. To me, it sounded the same. And you might say, well, Phil, what does it matter? You can see whether a BB is coming out of the barrel. this is true. But not always. Sometimes it's difficult, like if it's foggy or hazy or whatever, that's certainly one thing. But on Thursday night in particular, we were playing an evening game where it was darker and you could not see your BBs, whether they were coming out of the barrel or not. And I'm not using a tracer or anything like that. And so there certainly were situations where I was shooting my rifle and I was like, man, I should be hitting that guy. And actually, BBs weren't coming out. And it's not until one of my teammates was like, hey, Phil, you're skipping shots. And I was like, oh, okay, well, there's a problem there. So that's one of the things that I'm going to have to learn. Like, what does it sound like or what does it feel like when I'm dry firing my HPA compared to my AEG? And will I be able to tell? I certainly expect that I will be. But for right now, can't really tell the difference. That's one of the big adaptations or lessons that I learned right off the rip was, well, actually, you need to be more careful. And so I found myself doing a lot of admin reloads just to make sure that I had a fully topped off mag, because I knew that those would actually always feed, at least for the first, 20 or so shots. So that was one adaptation. And you may experience that as well, going from HPA, from AG to HPA. And it's not something that I actually had ever even considered before I took the field and was playing that evening game. As a side note, the evening game for me was definitely a weird experience, just because I've never really played too much when it starts getting dark, when visibility gets low. I also wear yellow tinted lenses, which made stuff look kind of weird. It made it in some ways look brighter than it actually was. But a lot of the benefit, I think, of the yellow tinted lenses was lost when it wasn't as sunny. So I wasn't super thrilled about that. I did have a weapon light mounted on my replica, and that was fine. That was okay. Didn't have any issue ergonomically. It was fine. But again, like, I didn't really have a need for it. It wasn't dark enough to really need it. And where we were playing, mostly in like wooded areas and stuff, when it started getting dark, it would not have been super ideal. But on the flip side of that, I did see a few people who had their lights on sort of accidentally, and you could see them a mile away. So that's a good note for me to remember that. And we've talked about it, I'm sure, on the Discord. People have talked about how light discipline is important. Like, if it's dark-ish and your light is on by mistake, I mean, you're just really, like, you're being a beacon of light, quite literally, to your opponent, to be like, oh, there's a guy. Like, we could see one person was inside of the two-story structure on the top story, because we could see that the walls inside were being illuminated, and even though we couldn't see the individual, we could see light coming out the top window. So what do you think is going on there? There's somebody in there, right? So that was one of the pieces. And I will say, I had zero expectation for performance going into that night game. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what to really think. And so, honestly, and I say night game, like, it didn't get dark, and the field has floodlights anyway in the village field, if you're familiar. So that part wasn't really a factor for me. But I also, like, I wasn't really thinking about how well I was doing. I was just sort of getting back into it and just thinking about having a good time, right? Thinking about putting BBs down range and, just joking around with John. John was, having a bit of a night where everything sort of, he felt like he was cursed. Nothing was working for him. He was, his primary was down. He was down to his pistol, like all this kind of stuff. But we had a good time nonetheless. And it was a good shakeout for me, because one of the other pieces of kit that I've changed, of course, because I'm using HPA, I have to carry my tank and all this kind of stuff. And so what I had done was I had purchased a Repro, like, Haley flat pack, right? And the reason I got a Repro one is because, firstly, I don't know if I would like it or not like it, number one. And number two, they're prohibitively expensive. So, like, if you're going to be, if you're made of money, then fine. But if you're really going to be trying something and you don't know whether, from a proof of concept standpoint, whether it works for you or it doesn't, I'm a huge proponent of trying something, and something cheap, understanding that, yeah, you may have to sink a little bit of money and get the more expensive thing if you want to make sure that it's really for you. But imagine a scenario where I drop $200 plus Canadian on a flat pack to realize that I hate it. Like, that would not be a good feeling. And yeah, you residual market, blah, blah, blah. But, like, realistically, it was easier for me to just find like a $30 Repro flat pack to try it out and see if I liked it. before I committed, or if I'm indeed going to commit to buying the real deal. Understanding too that for airsoft, yeah, the real deal is fine if you want. Is fine if you want to like flex on people, which I think is stupid. But regardless, um, a lot of repro kit is just fine for airsoft, right? It'll do you just fine, and there's no real need to go out there and spend considerably, like almost 10 times as much on the real thing. You will get roughly the same benefit. Now that doesn't apply for everything. Like we've said before, if you're going to spend money on real steel stuff, a sling is definitely something you want to spend real steel dollars on, but you're talking about like $80 versus $200 on a flat pack or more if you're looking like at a chest rig or like a plate carrier or all this kind of stuff. And yeah, so anyways, I went out and I bought this replica Haley flat pack. And yeah, it's not as nice and it's not as Gucci, but I wanted to see what it would be like. And the great thing about the flat pack, for those of you who don't know, is that it can be worn as a regular backpack, so like two straps over the shoulders kind of deal, or you can the strap is actually buckled with like a fast buckle. So what you can do is you can clip it directly into like the D3 CR style chest rigs, and then you can clip the pack automatically so that the chest rig and the pack are integrated basically into one unit. And conceptually, I was like, this sounds really like high speed. I'll be able to cinch it all tight together. It'll be one piece and it'll be great. And that's what I wore on Thursday at the evening game. And conceptually, it was actually a really great idea because I was able to put all the stuff that I wanted to carry to the game directly into the flat pack. So I had my Allen keys, my BBs, my loader. I had a granola bar in there. I had a spare set of iPro, my asthma inhaler, like everything that I would normally carry on my person in my backpack or in my box that I take to the field. I just had it all in the pack, which at the time seemed like a great idea. But when I started running around the field, that started like all the weight in there started swinging around. So that wasn't great because I really would have liked to ditch some of that extra weight, and I couldn't because it was attached to my chest rig and also carrying my HPA tank. So I couldn't ditch it. So I was like, okay, well, this is right off the rip is not super ideal. And so again, I took out all of the stuff from it, and I just left the HPA tank in there. And so I was using that for a while. And then what I still would find, it would not swing around as much, but it would still ride down because the HPA tank was heavier than the stuff I had in my test rig on the front. I mean, you're talking about, mid cap mags full of BBs. They don't actually weigh a whole lot. So what would happen is as I would run around the field, as I would, take corners, all this kind of stuff, slowly but surely, my chest rig would actually ride up and the tank would ride down. That's how gravity works, folks. I don't know what to tell you, which was roughly Jordan's answer when I started talking about it. But I digress. So then I started thinking about, okay, well, what can I do? Like, would I be able to use a Velcro sort of buckle on the front and then buckle that into my belt? That way the front wouldn't ride down. It's something similar I've done on, a cosplay that I worked on before to keep it all balanced. And I was thinking, well, I could do that because I have lots of buckles and I've got nylon, like it's not an issue. I could get that rigged up. And I'm like, yeah, I could do that. Or I could just do sort of what some other people in Discord do, which is just have your HPA tank in a separate pack. So for Saturday, that's what I did. I took my flat pack and I disconnected it from my chest rig. I just put the chest rig with the regular harness and I put that on, and then I put the backpack on, and that's what I used for the day. And that was much better because my chest rig stayed in place. I didn't have to fight sort of it riding up throughout the day. And then I had the backpack on, and then anytime I went to the safe zone or whatever, I could just ditch the backpack and I didn't have to worry about, oh, well, now I got to take everything off and put it back on again. Like I could just take it off, and that was much more convenient. So I really think that that's how I'm primarily going to run my kit this year, is going to be with the HPA tank separate. I also made sure that I wasn't carrying anything in the backpack, anything that was of any consequence. So in the backpack, I carried like a spare line, and because I feel like if your line goes down in the middle of a game, it's nice to have like a backup, and it doesn't really weigh a whole lot, so I was okay with that. My asthma inhaler still, I mean, I carry that all the time, but again, it doesn't really weigh a whole lot. A granola bar, that kind of stuff, and then all the rest, like the BBs and stuff, they stayed. They stayed back at the safe zone. I also need to start thinking about what it's going to look like when I'm using my kit, where I'm wearing my kit, I should say, for Iron Horse. Because at Iron Horse, like, yes, I'm going to have a fob bag, but I'm also going to want to make sure that I'm carrying probably a little bit more kit that I'm carrying at these, like, 15, 20-minute games, half an hour games, or whatever. Um, so that's one of the big things that I'm going to be checking out. Playing with John, he was running his full kit for Iron Horse, and like that's a huge amount. It's like the web gear. We're thinking about doing a video on this a little bit later, but like it's the web gear, it's all his pouches, his water bottles, like everything, and that's what he's playing with, which is fine. Like, more power to him, but at the same time, I'm taking a bit of a different approach where I'm sort of trying to figure out sort of piecemeal what's working and what's not for me, before sort of piecing even more things together. So that's where I'm at with that. Um, I also have another backpack that I want to try, which is just like a hydration pack, instead of the flat pack. But there's a few. I think I'm going to be doing some mods to the the flat pack, before I try anything else. Like, doing a little bit of reinforcement underneath the straps, with some grippy material so that it doesn't slide as much, which should be pretty easy to accomplish. Stuff like that. So overall, that's sort of what I've been looking at. I also picked up a pair of the Ideal Gear pants, the G3 trousers, after talking to Rob from Gunfather Milsim, and also Todd on the Discord, who likes those as well. I picked up a pair of those, and like, they're repro, but you know what? Again, the construction is great. I don't have really any concerns. They have integrated knee pads. I have them in olive drab just because it goes with a few of my different camo patterns that I want to use. I've been using the Swedish M90 primarily this year so far, but I mean, I'm keeping my options open. But they're really nice in terms of getting a good fit. I've mentioned before, like, I'm not super tall, but my waist is also not super super slim, so I end up typically having to go with like a large trouser, which means that they tend to be really long, which means that the knee pad is not in the right place. But these have Velcro adjustments, and you can they've got drawstring adjustments inside as well, so you can raise up the knee pad so you can have it exactly where you want, and that's been really great as well. Um, the other thing that I've been looking at this year, and we haven't really had any chance to sort of see what that's like, because it's been very cold here still so far. I mean, it's June 19th. We haven't seen a single day over 20 degrees, or near 20 degrees, in fact. But it's my iPro. So I've been using the ESS Advancer V12s, which are discontinued, but they were issued iPro of the UK armed forces. So for the longest time, you could still find them for a reasonable price on eBay and a few other places, but the supply is getting really, really low. I just bought a pod of the yellow tinted lenses, again, brand new, but I think it was like £8, which works out to about like $16 Canadian. And yeah, so that's getting pricey, considering the fact that I could get a pair of like Pyramex iPro for roughly the same amount. So, and they don't, you just can't find any clear ones at all anymore. It's either that or tinted, or like a smoke tinted. So I'm very soon getting to a point where my iPro is going to need to change, and I haven't changed iPro in conservatively since at least 2008. I'm going to say maybe even 2007. So it's been quite some time, and so I'm really going to be looking at different options for stuff that's still full seal, because that's mandatory where we play, but light, very breathable, and as good fog resistance as I can find. Understanding it's, again, not super. I mean, you're never going to find something that's completely fog proof, although there's some pretty clever solutions that were posted even on the Discord. We were talking to one of the guys from France who was explaining what they do to keep their iPro from fogging up, and the treatments that they use with soap and stuff, which was super super interesting. So In any event, that is sort of what the last couple of games were like. I will say, I've been really pleased overall with just how my personal skills are roughly where they were before we stopped the season, or before the end of the season last season. Like my ready ups, my reloads, I didn't feel particularly sloppy on anything that I was doing. Like my cover utilization was good. Had the chance to go prone, and it didn't feel like completely, out to lunch. Like it was all very well controlled. And one of the things that I'm really considering, and we mentioned this before, I think on the podcast, like one of the big objectives for us for this year is, for myself and Johnny in particular, is like improving our communication between the two of us so that we're more in sync, more in tune. Again, thinking about Iron Horse, making sure that we're not finishing each other's sentences, but getting to that point where we know what we're going to do on the field, and all this kind of stuff, which is great. One of the things that I'm trying to think about is improving my own positions whenever I'm on the field somewhere. So making sure that I'm well positioned, that I'm well utilizing my cover, that I'm slowly but surely improving my position whenever I can. So, for instance, when we were playing on Saturday, I found myself behind a piece of cover, and I knew that my opponents were moving in a particular direction, and so I'm looking at where I am right now and thinking, okay, I can't move from where I am, because if I move forward, I'm very, very likely going to get hit and tagged out by an opponent. So what can I do in this particular position to improve my cover utilization, make myself a little bit smaller, give myself a bit of a better fire lane, like all this kind of stuff. And so I ended up from one position just shifting my knees and making myself a little bit smaller, tucking into the cover a little bit more, and then finally deciding, okay, you know what, I'm going to go prone, and going prone and getting a better fire lane, and sort of just working through that process in my own mind. And then thinking, okay, am I still being useful? Is this still an effective position to be in? I know where my opponents are. If they cross, I'll be able to shoot them very easily. In fact, my opponents in this particular game, Pat was on the other team. I shot him from that position twice. He kept coming back, and I was able to get him out both times. There's a guy in a white hoodie. I was able to get him as well. And so I was doing pretty okay. And then at some point I was like, you know what, maybe it's time for me to peel back and try and rejoin sort of the line where my teammates were. And, but that's when Matt was able to get me on the side, because he had flanked around. And it turns out that my buddies who I thought were there had actually gone, and I just didn't notice. So anyway, lesson for me is really in like sort of improving my position and not staying in one position too long, making sure that I'm still connected to the team. A bit harder to do in a pickup game where you're just playing with random people who are there, but it was still a really good experience, and I was glad to see that I'm finding myself sort of thinking in this way. The other thing that I was sort of really happy about was in one of the games that we were playing, we played on the road game, which is basically just like a linear sort of attack on both sides, a couple of respawns on the team, etc. And we played the first game, and we played on one side, and then when we got to basically just running it back and switching sides, when we got to the other side, I said to my teammates, hey, so do you remember what we did last time? And they were like, yeah, we basically just rushed to the middle to try and get the best position that we could. And I said, I really think that that's what they're going to do too. And they sort of agreed with me, and they're like, yeah, probably. And I said, well, when we were doing that and we were rushing, how effective would we have been at trying to shoot at our opponents when they're pushing down the field? And they're like, well, probably not. We were really focused on just trying to get in the right position. And so I said, okay, let's assume they're going to do the same thing. And if they don't, then it's my bad. But I think that they're going to be laser focused on getting as far as they can. And I think we can use that opportunity to move to this a point of domination, which is, for those of you who are local, the Crow's Nest. I'm pretty sure we can run there and take that point of domination relatively unimpeded, because they're not going to be in any position to put effective fire down to prevent us. Now, it's a huge trot. It's completely open to get out there, but I think we can do it. And the team was like, yeah, that's a little crazy, but we can try it. And I was like, and because it's my stupid idea, I volunteer to do it. Like, I will be the one who does the run, and you guys can run back behind me. And they're like, okay, fine, sure. And so that's what we did. The whistle blew, and I just took off, and there was a couple of guys behind me, and I managed to get to the Crow's Nest. Now, did they shoot at me? Yes. Was it effective? No. I could feel the BBs, or I could hear the BBs, I should say, zipping around me, but that they weren't being effective because they weren't in any good position to actively lay down fire on the crow's nest. And so this was a situation for me where I'm thinking about, okay, what is it that they want to do and how are they going to accomplish it? And then what am I going to do to exploit that? And I think when you're playing at fields that you are very, very familiar with, especially when you have games where you do one thing and then you run it back and do it the other way, there's a huge, huge advantage to be gained to thinking about, okay, what would my opponents do? What are they going to do based on my experience at this field? And how am I going to exploit that? And chances are, if you are on that side, you can think about what you would do and what would be the best way for you to for the other team to exploit that, right? If you're in that position, you're like, boy, I wish they didn't do this. Well, maybe when you're on the reverse side, you should absolutely do that because they might not be able to take advantage of it. So it was a good experience for me in thinking about what can we do a little bit differently? How can we exploit what our opponents are going to do? And the fact that I'm suggesting it, but also the one who's happy to execute it, I think makes a difference. Like if you're going to ask your team to do something like crazy, you have to be sort of willing to be a participant. Otherwise, it's kind of bad faith. I think if I had said it's like, hey guys, yeah, I'm positive they're not going to be able to shoot at the crow's nest, but you guys do it. It's like no, like I've got to be the one who does it, right? So that was a good experience, and I'm glad that we did that because there's something I'll be considering in future. And I mean, if you're local and you're listening to this now, you know that that's something that I want to try more. But there's a huge there's if you play at a field regularly, you know what the points of domination are. Right, most of the fields that people play on, they have them, and you know them as a player. Like, oh, I really hope I get there first because from there I can do X, Y, Z. Right. Well, same sort of thing, right? For us, it's like, oh, I hope I get on the crow's nest because from there I can, do X, Y, Z. Well, yeah, great. So that was a good experience for me, and I think hopefully you can take something from that as well for yourselves. So, couple of encouraging days, a couple of encouraging games. It's funny though because after having done Last Refuge and seeing the engagement and the types of games we were playing there, just going back and playing just regular village games sort of hits different. Like I wasn't particularly enthused about playing just the regular village games like we've done, hundreds of times before, and I found myself sort of just skipping them a bit more, just sort of sitting on the sideline being like, yeah, I'm not really feeling that right now, I'll just watch or what have you. Um, and I think there's also something to be said about communicating with your refs and telling them when there are things that you'd like to do different, which is something that I did as well. Although I didn't want to be the one who always says stuff. So, if you have people in your community, you can encourage people to speak up. But like the ref was suggesting, hey, let's do another village game. And I was like, can we not? Like we have other fields that are available to us. Why don't we do something different? And the ref was all over that, right? Noah was like, hey, yeah, sure, let's do that. Let's just do, the woods top to bottom instead. Cool, sounds great. Let's do that. We hadn't done that day, so there's a huge advantage. If you find that games are getting stale, of just being like, hey, why don't we try something different? Whether that's an objective instead of team deathmatch, whether that's capture the flag, whether that's changing the orientation, changing the spawn zones, whatever, to try and keep it a bit fresh. We've talked about that on the podcast before. I'm not going to get too into the details, but regardless, there's a little bit of that going on in my mind. And so the key thing that I need to do is sort of take action, right? Like if I'm feeling like, oh, this is stale, well, say something, right? And then once I say something, then there's an opportunity for someone to do about it. If I just sort of grumble about it to myself, what's that going to solve, right? So all that said, really excellent a couple of games. I'm very much looking forward to more games this season. I really hope that John and I get as much trigger time together as we want to sort of prep for Iron Horse. I know physically I'm not going to have any trouble. Like my physical training has been fine. My running that I was talking about and stuff is doing great. So no issues there. I never felt winded. I never felt tired. I didn't bring food with me to the game on Saturday. I was just like, yeah, whatever. I didn't have food, didn't have water, which is not wise. I don't recommend that to anybody. But it was fine for me. I didn't have any issues. So on that front, like that part is fine. The biggest thing we need to work on is just coordination, communication, and then just aggression on the field and making sure that we're making the right plays and whatnot. But yeah, so that's sort of the recap of my last couple of games. I was excited to talk about it. It's too bad Pat wasn't here, but we'll get him next time and talk about his experience because he was out at the game on Saturday. He had a vastly different experience than I had, which I will let him speak to. But that's all I really have for you this week. A little bit of a shorter one. Um, as I always mention, if you want to keep the conversation going, hit us up on Discord. The link is in the description. If you want to see more videos of ours, we have our YouTube channel as well. If you're not currently watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify, our YouTube channel is at Storm Riders. And we're going to be trying to make some different content, some different things in the months to come. But until then, that's really all I got for you. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.